January 7, 1945. Inside a dimly lit headquarters in Europe. The air is heavy with cigarette smoke and silence. Maps cover the walls, creased, repinned, marked by arrows that no longer inspire confidence. Outside, winter presses against the windows. Inside, something far colder has settled. At the center of the room stands Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. His uniform is immaculate. His face is not. For days, reports have arrived faster than they can be answered. Requests, complaints, warnings, and accusations, all circling the same name. The phone rings again. Eisenhower does not answer it immediately. Across the channel, an Allied army has stalled. Timetables are slipping. Supplies are misallocated. American divisions, tens of thousands of men, are tied to a command structure that no longer produces results. Officers whisper that pride has replaced coordination. Staff officers quietly ask a question no one wants to say aloud: who's really in control? On Eisenhower's desk lies a stack of documents bearing the signature of Bernard Montgomery. Each paper represents authority. Each one also represents risk. This is not a battlefield crisis. No artillery is firing. No tanks are moving. But the consequences of what happens in this room will reach the front lines within days. Eisenhower understands that if he hesitates, thousands of American soldiers may pay for decisions made far from the sound of gunfire. He looks again at the maps. Allied unity, so carefully constructed now, threatens to fracture under the weight of ego and command. Rivalry. One order could stabilize everything. One order could tear it all apart. And if this decision goes wrong, the cost will not be measured in reputation, but in lives. Within days, one signature will quietly redraw the balance of power inside the Allied command structure. No public announcement will explain it. No press conference will admit what is about to happen. On the surface, the alliance will appear intact: flags aligned, statements polite, smiles carefully maintained. But beneath that surface, authority will shift in a way that has not happened since the invasion of Europe began. An army that once answered to one man will soon answer to another. Planning. Rooms will change tone. Orders will no longer pass through familiar hands. Careers built on reputation rather than results will be placed in jeopardy, while others long restrained will suddenly be unleashed. This is not a story about victory arriving overnight. It is about the moment when patience ends. Before this decision, Allied operations move slowly, constrained by caution and personal rivalry. After it, the war in Western Europe accelerates brutally, relentlessly, and with consequences no one fully anticipates. Eisenhower does not yet know whether this choice will be remembered as decisive leadership or as the moment Allied unity nearly shattered from within. That truth will only emerge after reputations collide. Commands are stripped, and American soldiers are forced to fight under a new reality shaped by one irreversible order. The crisis confronting Eisenhower in January 1945 did not begin in that headquarters room. Its roots stretched back months into a pattern of stalled momentum, bruised alliances, and decisions that left soldiers paying for command-level pride. The warning signs appeared after the breakout from Normandy. Allied forces had the advantage. Manpower, air superiority, and supply depth unmatched by anything Germany could now replace. Yet that advantage began to bleed away, not through enemy brilliance, but through paralysis at the top. Entire American corps were held in reserve while opportunity slipped past them. Armored divisions waited for orders that never came. Infantry units advanced, stopped, then advanced again, burning fuel, time, and lives without decisive results. By late summer 1944, American planners were asking why speed had vanished from a war that demanded urgency. The answer was uncomfortable. Operational control in key sectors had become centralized around one commander's vision, a vision defined by rigid planning and a refusal to adapt once reality intruded. Timetables were treated as sacred documents, even when the battlefield rendered them obsolete. Requests for flexibility were interpreted as challenges to authority. The cost was immediate and measurable. In delayed offensives, American divisions suffered thousands of casualties securing objectives that should have fallen weeks earlier. Supply bottlenecks worsened because movement priorities favored prestige operations over practical necessity. Fuel shortages immobilized U.S. armor while German forces regrouped, escaped encirclement, or dug in. Then came the public humiliation. In press briefings, responsibility for Allied setbacks was quietly deflected. Credit flowed upward. Blame flowed sideways. American commanders who raised concerns found themselves marginalized. Their troops, meanwhile, continued to absorb losses created not by enemy resistance alone, but by indecision at the operational level. The insult deepened when strategic disagreements became personal theater. Meetings intended to resolve coordination instead turned into contests of reputation. Arguments were framed not around outcomes, but around who had been right months earlier. The war slowed not because it had to, but because ego demanded vindication. By autumn, Eisenhower faced a grim arithmetic. The Allied advance had lost its rhythm. Casualty reports climbed into the tens of thousands across multiple armies. And, worst of all, the Germans, supposedly beaten, were being given time. That time would soon be used against the Allies. In December 1944, German forces launched a surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes. American units bore the brunt of the initial impact. Entire divisions were mauled, encircled, or destroyed. Emergency redeployments followed, chaotic, costly, and avoidable had earlier momentum been maintained. For Eisenhower, the conclusion was unavoidable. The failure was not courage. American troops fought with determination under impossible conditions. The failure was command rigidity and insistence on control that ignored the realities unfolding on the ground. Every lost day had compounded risk. Every delayed decision had multiplied casualties. And now, with winter tightening its grip in Germany, proving it still had teeth, Eisenhower was forced to confront the truth he had long resisted. Unity without effectiveness was no longer acceptable. And someone would have to pay the price for that realization. By early 1945, the Allied command structure was no longer a unified machine. It was a fragile balance of personalities, each powerful, each convinced of his own necessity, and each pulling the war in a different direction. At the center stood Dwight D. Eisenhower. His authority was absolute on paper. In reality, it was negotiated daily. Eisenhower was not a battlefield tactician by instinct. He was a coalition manager. His greatest strength was holding together nations, egos, and ambitions that could easily fracture the alliance. But that same strength was also his weakness. He tolerated friction longer than most commanders, would believing unity itself was a weapon. Opposite him stood Bernard Montgomery, a commander driven by control and certainty. Montgomery believed wars were won by deliberate preparation, narrow fronts, and tightly held authority. He distrusted improvisation and resented interference. To him, hesitation was not caution, it was discipline. But discipline, once divorced from results, hardened into inflexibility. Montgomery demanded deference, not coordination, and expected Allied plans to conform to his vision. Then there was George Patton, the antithesis of Montgomery. Aggressive, impatient, and relentless, Patton believed momentum saved lives. He pushed his armies until fuel ran dry and then demanded more. To Patton, delay was the real enemy. He openly criticized plans that restrained American forces for the sake of careful symmetry. His successes embarrassed those who prized method over speed. Between these poles stood Omar Bradley, pragmatic and deeply protective of American troops. Bradley did not seek spectacle, he sought clarity. And he grew increasingly frustrated, watching U.S. divisions constrained by decisions made far from their front lines. His loyalty to Eisenhower was firm, but it was being tested by the mounting cost of deference. Their goals no longer aligned. Montgomery wanted consolidated power and proof that his method was superior. Patton wanted freedom to exploit opportunities without restraint. Bradley wanted accountability for losses that could no longer be justified. Eisenhower wanted the alliance to survive long enough to win the war. Only one of them could decide. If Eisenhower backed Montgomery fully, he preserved Allied harmony but risked further paralysis. If he empowered the Americans, he risked humiliating Britain's most celebrated commander and shattering political trust. This was not a contest of rank. It was a contest of whose judgment would shape the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and whose ego would be forced to yield. And the judge could no longer delay the verdict. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It arrived in waves, each one harder to ignore than the last. In the days following the Ardennes crisis, Eisenhower's headquarters became a corridor of quiet confrontations. Reports crossed his desk describing the same problem from different angles: fragmented command, delayed responses, and American formations answering to priorities they did not control. Each memo carried the same unspoken warning: this cannot continue. The first ultimatum was subtle: operational authority, temporarily expanded during the emergency, was expected to contract once the crisis passed. But the contraction never fully happened. Decisions continued to bottleneck. Requests for American flexibility were returned with conditions. Eisenhower realized that what had been justified as emergency unity was solidifying into permanent imbalance. He raised the issue privately. The response was defensive. Arguments were framed as misunderstandings. Delays were described as necessary. Caution. Losses were portrayed as unfortunate but unavoidable. No responsibility was accepted. No adjustment was offered. So Eisenhower applied pressure elsewhere. He empowered American commanders to bypass layers of coordination when speed demanded it. He reassigned planning responsibilities. He altered briefing structures, quietly reducing whose voice carried weight in the room. Each change was small. Each one signaled the same message: control is not guaranteed. The reaction was immediate. Complaints followed, letters were drafted, political channels stirred. All eyes reminded Eisenhower of public opinion, of symbols, of reputations built over years of war. The implication was clear: strip authority too openly, and the alliance itself could fracture. That was the fear loop. Accept the status quo, and risk continued failure, or force change and risk collapse from within. Eisenhower waited. Then came the second ultimatum. American armies were preparing for renewed offensives. The scale was enormous: hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, a logistical effort that could not tolerate ambiguity. Eisenhower issued a directive redefining command boundaries. American formations would now answer directly to American operational leadership for execution, not merely administration. The language was precise. The meaning was unmistakable. Authority was being stripped. Without ceremony. There was no public rebuke, no announcement of disgrace. But for a commander accustomed to absolute control, the effect was humiliating. Decisions, once made unilaterally, now required coordination. Orders once assumed were now negotiated. The pressure intensified. Staff officers began to sense which way the wind was blowing. Meetings grew tense. Silence replaced confidence. Each operational success by American forces sharpened the contrast. Each delay elsewhere magnified the question Eisenhower refused to ask aloud: why is this still necessary? Then came the final ultimatum. Eisenhower convened a closed-door discussion. No aides, no minutes. The message was delivered calmly, almost clinically. The alliance could not survive divided execution. The war could not afford personal doctrine over collective results. Either command adapted, or it would be redefined. There was no appeal to pride. There was no threat spoken. But the consequence was clear. Accept reduced authority, or lose it entirely. For Montgomery, the choice was devastating. Accepting meant public survival, but private diminishment. Refusing meant political disaster and operational removal. For Eisenhower, the risk was equal: alienate Britain's most famous field commander, or continue sacrificing American momentum. Fear loop closed. Eisenhower signed the orders. American troops, nearly 300,000 men, were formally removed from Montgomery's operational control. The transfer was administrative, efficient, and irreversible. It happened without headlines, without speeches, and without apology. But its impact was seismic. Careers shifted overnight. Influence evaporated. Planning rooms recalibrated. And for the first time since Normandy, American commanders held both responsibility and authority in equal measure. Eisenhower had crossed the line. He had spent months avoiding. Unity had been preserved in name. Power had been redistributed in fact, and from this point forward, there would be no return to the old. But balance only consequences. Asterisk, the removal of American troops from Montgomery's operational control was not symbolic. It was followed immediately by structural changes designed to correct the very failures that had brought Eisenhower to the brink. The first shift was speed. American armies were no longer required to align their tempo with a single, centralized timetable. Commanders received clear authority to exploit breakthroughs the moment they appeared. Delays for extended replanning were discouraged. Momentum long restrained became doctrine. This altered how decisions were made on the ground, where orders had once climbed and descended through layered approval. Authority now moved laterally and downward. Corps and army commanders were expected to act, not wait. If an opportunity was missed, responsibility would be personal and consequences immediate. This clarity eliminated the paralysis that had plagued earlier operations. The second change was logistical realism. Supply priorities were restructured to match operational need rather than prestige. Fuel, ammunition, and transport were rooted to formations in motion, not those holding carefully planned positions. This addressed a critical failure of 1944, when American armor sat immobilized while resources were allocated elsewhere. In the name of balance, training emphasis shifted as well. Staff officers were instructed to plan for adaptation rather than perfection. Contingency planning replaced rigid sequencing. Intelligence updates were treated as triggers for action, not reasons for delay. The system began to reward responsiveness instead of adherence to doctrine. Equally important was what ended. There would be no single narrow axis imposed across all Allied armies. No commander would dictate tempo outside his own formations. Coordination remained essential, but it was now collaborative, not hierarchical. This reduced friction and removed the perception that American forces existed to validate someone else's theory of warfare. The human impact was immediate. American commanders reported higher morale, not because the war was easier, but because responsibility and authority finally matched. Decisions that risked lives were now made by those closest to the consequences. Trust, eroded by months of constraint, began to return. Eisenhower reinforced this shift personally. He visited American headquarters more frequently. He listened more. Then he spoke. When disagreements arose, he resolved them quickly, privately, decisively, and without theater. His message was consistent. Results mattered more than reputations. Montgomery, for his part, remained in command of British forces. His influence did not vanish, but it was bounded. His plans no longer dictated Allied movement by default. He adapted outwardly, even as resentment lingered beneath the surface. This was the true transformation, not a dramatic purge, not a public humiliation, but a system corrected to reflect reality. The alliance still existed. The war still demanded cooperation. But command was no longer confused with entitlement. By redistributing authority, Eisenhower had done something more dangerous than choosing sides. He had changed how power functioned inside the Allied war machine. The test would come soon, because systems only prove their worth when pressure returns. And on the Western Front, pressure was never far away. The effects of Eisenhower's decision did not remain theoretical for long. Within weeks, the Western Front became a proving ground, one that would expose whether redistributed authority could deliver what centralized control had not. The contrast was immediate. Before the change, American advances were cautious and uneven. Breakthroughs were treated as planning problems rather than opportunities. Units paused to realign, resupply, and await approval, giving German forces time to withdraw in order and establish new defensive lines. After the shift, that pattern broke. American armies began to move with intent. When resistance weakened, exploitation followed without delay. Armor surged forward while infantry secured flanks behind it, not ahead of it. Supply columns were pushed aggressively, keeping pace rather than lagging behind. Doctrine. The numbers told the story. In sectors now under direct American operational control, daily advances increased dramatically. Objectives that had previously taken weeks to secure were now taken in days. German formations, deprived of time, were forced into hasty retreats, abandoning equipment and positions that might once have been defended. Casualties did not vanish, but they changed in character. Losses were increasingly the result of contact with a collapsing enemy, rather than prolonged assaults against prepared defenses. American units suffered fewer attritional engagements. Momentum reduced exposure. Speed limited enemy choice. The payoff became unmistakable as Allied forces crossed into Germany itself. American commanders coordinated directly with neighboring armies rather than through imposed sequencing. When one formation advanced faster, others adjusted, not by slowing success, but by supporting it. The front became fluid, not brittle. German command struggled to respond. Their defenses had been designed to exploit Allied predictability. When that predictability vanished, cohesion followed. Retreats became routes. Counterattacks arrived too late or in the wrong place. The initiative once surrendered by Allied hesitation now belonged firmly to the Americans. Eisenhower observed the results with relief and vindication. The same forces that had appeared cautious months earlier now demonstrated aggression and adaptability. The difference was not bravery. It was permission. Permission to act. Permission to decide. Permission to accept responsibility without waiting for validation. The ultimate test came not in a single battle, but in sustained pressure. Day after day, American formations advanced, adjusted, and advanced again. There was no dramatic pause, no return to stagnation. The system held. And with each mile gained, the earlier arguments lost their weight. The theory that caution saved lives could not withstand evidence that speed saved more. The belief that centralized control ensured coordination collapsed in the face of effective collaboration. By spring 1945, the outcome was undeniable. The war in the West had entered its final phase, not because one commander was superior to another, but because the structure of command finally matched the realities of modern warfare. Eisenhower's gamble had paid off, but victory, as always, carried a cost beyond maps and metrics, and that cost would not be erased by success. The success of Eisenhower's decision did not erase the damage that came before it, nor did it spare those caught in the transition between authority and outcome. Careers were reshaped without ceremony. Officers who had built their identity on proximity to power found themselves sidelined. Influence faded quietly, replaced by new voices and new priorities. For some, the loss was professional. For others, it was deeply personal. Reputation, once treated as a weapon, became a burden. Montgomery remained a celebrated figure, but the reduction of his authority was unmistakable to those inside the system. The humiliation was never spoken aloud, yet it lingered in every planning session where his word no longer carried final weight. He adapted outwardly, but the resentment never fully disappeared. For American commanders, empowerment came with its own burden. Authority meant accountability. Decisions that saved time also carried risk. When errors occurred, there was no longer a distant doctrine to absorb blame. Responsibility was immediate and visible. Some officers thrived under that clarity. Others did not. The greatest cost, however, was borne by the soldiers. Thousands of American lives had been lost or stalled, momentum losses that might have been avoided had authority aligned with reality sooner. Those men would never benefit from the correction. Their families would never know how close the system came to change before it arrived too late. Even the accelerated victories carried suffering. Faster advances meant longer supply lines, exhausted units, and relentless pressure on men already hardened by years of combat. Speed reduced attrition, but it did not eliminate fear, trauma, or grief. Towns were taken quickly, but at the price of civilian displacement and destruction that left scars long after liberation. Eisenhower understood this contradiction. Leadership had required him to choose between imperfect options. Delay had cost lives. Action would cost others. There was no decision free of consequence, only one that offered a chance to end the war sooner. The moral weight of that choice did not disappear with success. That it followed Eisenhower beyond the war, into reflections he rarely shared. The alliance had survived. The campaign had succeeded. But the human ledger could never be balanced. Victory, in this case, was not a clean triumph. It was a correction made late, and it carried the quiet acknowledgement that even the right decision, made under pressure, leaves behind losses no command order can undo. Eisenhower's single quotes decision to strip Montgomery of American troops was not an act of rivalry, nor a rejection of Allied unity. It was a recognition that power, when left uncorrected, can become more dangerous than the enemy itself. What was gained was clarity. Authority finally matched responsibility. Momentum replaced hesitation. American forces fought under commanders who could decide and be judged by results rather than doctrine. The Western Front moved forward not because one theory proved superior, but because the system stopped protecting pride at the expense of lives. What was lost was something less visible, but no less real. Trust between allies was scarred. A celebrated commander was diminished in silence. Months of unnecessary suffering could not be reclaimed. Thousands of men paid the price for decisions corrected too late. This was not a clean victory of right over wrong. It was leadership under constraint. Eisenhower did not act when it was comfortable. He acted when delay had become more dangerous than division. In doing so, he accepted political risk, personal resentment, and historical scrutiny because the war demanded results, not harmony. The lesson endures beyond World War II. Coalitions do not fail from lack of courage. They fail when authority becomes immune to consequence, when reputation outranks reality, when leaders confuse unity with silence. Eisenhower chose fracture over stagnation, quietly, deliberately, and without applause. The war ended sooner because of it. But the cost of waiting so long ensured that this decision would never be remembered as heroic, only as necessary. And in war, necessity is often the heaviest verdict of all.